Welcome to another episode of At the Table with CASA, where we bring together the leaders, innovators, and advocates shaping the future of care at home. Presented by California Association for Health Services at Home, with support from Access. Access is a leading global technology platform for healthcare at home, empowering more than 9,000 organizations to deliver care to over 5 million patients worldwide. You can find out more about them at access.com. That's AXXESS.com. My name is Mark Wilson, and today we have a very special guest. And I was thinking before we jumped on here, how fitting, since it's CASA's 60th anniversary, that this guy would agree to join us at the table. Berger is one of California's true pioneers in home-based care, perhaps even the godfather. In 1980, Berger founded accredited home care services with a vision that was really ahead of its time, helping patients receive high-quality health care and support services in the comfort and dignity of their own homes. What a concept. What began as a small operation in Southern California grew under his leadership into one of the state's most respected and successful home care organizations, serving thousands of patients annually and employing thousands of caregivers and healthcare professionals throughout California. Over the course of more than 4 decades, Berger became a leading voice for home health, hospice, and home care services. He, in fact, was the chairman of the California Association for Health Services at Home and helped advance policies and advocacy efforts that strengthened access to care for Californians across this state. Today, his experience, his perspective, and his leadership continue to provide valuable insight into the challenges and opportunities facing providers and healthcare as healthcare increasingly moves beyond the walls of hospitals and into the home. So, please join me in welcoming Berger to At the Table with CASA. Barry, good to see you, my friend.
Good seeing you. Good seeing you.
Yeah, it's been a while. I remember meeting you, I think maybe 15 years ago, and I was just sort of starstruck because of your legacy. But let's, if you don't mind, start by going back to the very beginning. When you founded Accredited, I believe it was just you and your dad was your first employee, correct?
Yeah. Well, I think I have an interesting story, and I think it's something that will maybe inspire future and current people, leaders in home care. So I grew up in the 50s and 60s in Chicago, and I was the youngest of 4 children and grew up in a suburb of Chicago back in the 60s, early 60s, mid 60s. Education was stressed by our parents, and quite frankly, many of the people that I graduated grade school and high school with became overachievers. I take a look at my graduating class in high school and take a look at the doctors and the lawyers and some of the politicians that are around and go, wow, we really got a great education and, became pillars of the community as we move forward as adults. So I'm the youngest of 4 children and kind of the black sheep of the family, so to speak. My brother, who's 10 years older than me, is a non-practicing physician. He has not practiced in over 50 years. But what he did and what he does today, he's 81 years old, and he's the founder of a large medical imaging company called RadNet that many of you may have known or know. That's a publicly traded company. So he's set the bar pretty high for the 3 of us siblings, but we all kind of reached our potential as we became adults. And my 2 sisters and myself, along with my brother, really emulate how we grew up in the suburb of Chicago. So I went to graduating high school. I decided, it was time to get out of the cold weather of Chicago and moved to Arizona, where I attended Arizona State University. I always joke with people when I was giving talks for CASA. I would always start it and say I went to the Harvard of the West. People usually thought it was Stanford, but it was Arizona State. And I was a proud C student when I graduated. So, and I say that because whereas education is so important, your spirit, your knowledge, your drive is what's going to bring you to that next level along with your education. And if all you have is education, but you don't have the drive, you don't have the spirit, you probably won't be as successful as you can. And that's what I tried to talk about as I talked about my career. So when I graduated college, my brother was just starting his business imaging career, and it was back in 1976. And I came to work for him. And whereas I showed up the first day to his company with a briefcase with nothing in it and a leisure suit, thinking 1976.
I remember those. I remember those leisure suits.
Yeah, I wish I still had it. It'd be a relic.
Yeah.
Thinking I was going to start marketing his company and ultimately become the president. I was told to come home the next day, come back at 5 in the morning, and I would proceed to deliver radiopharmaceuticals to hospitals throughout LA and Orange County to get them there before they expired, their half-lives expired. Not really what I thought a college graduate would do. So I actually left after a year, went to work for a reference laboratory like Quest today, but a small company in the Van Nuys area, did marketing for them, and became disenchanted with that industry. A lot of similar to the home care industry today, a lot of fraud, a lot of abuse way back into the 70s on that. So as my lack of success the first couple, 2, 3 years out of college occurred, I remember going for an interview to become a sales rep for something called a nurse's registry back then. That's what home care was called. It was a little different model back then. And I remember interviewing for this position. I thought I could really do it. And I didn't get the job. They hired a nurse to do marketing. But I was intrigued. I was 25 years old. I was intrigued by the industry. And I thought, wow, this is something maybe I could get into. And I remember going to my parents, my mother and father, and I said, hey, I want to open up a nursing registry. Loan me money to do it. And they looked at me like, okay, what do you know about it? And I knew nothing. And parental advice was, well, why don't you go get a job with another company, see how you like it. And if you like it, let's talk. So I went to work for a company called Quality Care. Mark, I don't know if you remember them back in the 70s. Publicly traded company on the NASDAQ back then, based out of New York. And I ran their Pasadena office. And they strictly did private duty, home care giving, not licensed care. And they had a couple hundred offices around the country. And this was 79. And I realized very quickly that this was a business of relationships, no different than any business. But this particular business was all about getting people to like you. It was going to a discharge planner, what we called back then. And basically, he or she is not buying your product. They are referring you. So there's no money exchanged. They really don't care how much the actual cost is you're charging, as long as it's legitimate and the services are good, they're going to refer to you. Who wants to refer to someone you don't like? So I did very well with this quality care company. And 8 months later, somebody who worked for the company said, hey, Barry, you don't know many people in LA. Why don't you join the JCs, which is like a Rotary Club
Mm-hmm.
for younger people. Back then it was men only, and you had to be like under 35. So I joined it, and the JCs were affiliated with the Rotary Club. And sure enough, there was a guy in the Rotary Club that owned a home care company. And we got introduced. He was a lot older than me. He was my father's age. And we decided to open up a branch of his company in the San Fernando Valley, in the Van Nuys area. And the name of the company back then was Associated Nurses. His name was Bob Dunn. Nice guy. We each put up money. We opened up the office and we struggled. It was really tough that first couple years, as any business is just to try to survive. And I remember every Sunday I would flip open the LA Times want ads to maybe look at jobs because I didn't know whether this was going to work. But perseverance paid off.
What was the toughest part of that? What made it so difficult?
Well, it was generating business, gaining business. I was young. I was 26 years old and just kind of cutting my teeth and learning about business. And it was me and my father. My father had just retired or had retired 4 or 5 years ago, was having a hard time with retirement. And this was an opportunity for him to jump back into the business world, kind of help me. He answered the phones.
Was there something though? At what point did you look at home-based care and say, yeah, there's a future in this? What was that point?
I believed in it from the beginning. It was just a matter of getting it off the ground, getting the referral sources, the hospitals in the area, the social service agencies to really know who I was and to try to give us a shot. And ultimately what happened was you get a few breaks. I'll never forget I got my first 24-hour around the clock license case where maybe I billed 3,000 a week, maybe, okay, which would be like 30,000 a week today. But that was a big break. I was making $500 a week on that one case, which was, I paid a lot of bills, back in 1979, 1980, my rent for 1,000 square foot office was $700 a month, to put it in perspective. So I kept keeping on and just every day go out, market. My dad would hang out in the office, answer the phone. People would trickle in to apply. Taught him how to take inquiries. He was a very charming guy. Father and son was a, feel good thing that we could market. Again, a lot of it was getting people to like you.
Sure. I want to ask you too, back to the 1980, you're saying that was
Yeah,
about the
yeah,
time.
yeah.
We're looking today at and I know there's workforce shortages just dominate the conversation today. What was it like back then? Did you have difficulty getting people to work?
No, no, and I put things in perspective. When I started my business, Jimmy Carter was still president.
Mhm.
That's how far back we're going. Reagan was just starting to come on the scene and blah, blah, blah. But, California, there was no shortage of caregivers. Now, with that being said, obviously, the rules, the regs, the I-9s, things that we had to do, starting in the 90s, they weren't in place back then. And, you did criminal background checks, people were required to have Social Security cards, but it was totally different back then than it is today.
Would you say it was easier to
Much,
enter the business?
yeah, much, much easier.
What would surprise us back then about doing business back then, today?
Lack of regulation made it easier, and the competition. There was no competition. People, there were no franchises. There were no home care franchises. There were a handful of us out there. The model back then, which I didn't do, was it was a true registry where a caregiver would register with you. They would be put on an assignment, and instead of you billing the client directly and picking up all the payroll taxes and paying the caregiver, the client would pay the caregiver, and the caregiver would give 10% back to the owner.
Wow, had no idea that's the way it
Yeah,
was.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah, yeah, yeah. True independent contractors, and like a talent agent, you get your 10%.
It's the Uber of home care.
Yeah, 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 yeah. It's it's pretty amazing, how things have changed and where they're gone today. And and we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves, but I remember probably in the early 2000s, and some of my colleagues that are still on the CASA board today, Brittany, Salerno, and a few other of us old timers, we were the ones that advocated. The handwriting was on the wall that the industry was going to be regulated, period. And we got behind the regulation to put it the way we wanted it, to make it easy to comply with the laws, whereas you didn't have assembly members and senators trying to put legislation together that they had no idea how the industry worked. So we crafted that actual licensing back probably in the early 2000s. I remember Brittany and I, and another guy by the name of Eric Eberly, who ironically it's his birthday today, I saw on Facebook. We were all on the board. We had daily conference calls amongst the three of us, along with other CASA staff, to put this legislation together, which actually got passed, you know, during our time on the board.
Mhm.
Mhm. So that was a big accomplishment.
Well, let's take that to today, Barry. If you were speaking directly to policymakers today, what's the one thing you'd want them to better understand about, care that's delivered in the home?
People ask me, what was the biggest changes over the 41 years that you own that business? And I would say this, and I would say it to a politician. When I started in 1980, if you were 70, 75, you were old. And that's who target market was. People didn't live in their 90s, let alone. So that was fast forward to 2026, 2021, when I retired. The industry, what has happened is people are getting sicker, younger, and people are living longer. So you're picking up clients and patients that are in their 30s and 40s that have cancer, that have, genetic diseases that weren't occurring back in the 60s and 70s and 80s. It's all environmental. It's what's occurred. And then, be it good or bad, my mother lived to 96. My wife's mother lived to 91. And people are just living longer. There weren't assisted living facilities back in the 80s and 90s like there are today. I mean, the whole senior care has just gone crazy. And that's what I would tell a politician is, as you're making policy, and without getting too political, there is going to be a shortage. There is now, of caregivers and licensed nurses and therapists to take care of the aging population, us baby boomers. And how are you going to deal with that if you are making it harder for the caregiving force to enter the industry, however they enter? And that's probably the biggest frustration.
Speaking of regulations and reimbursement pressures and all the public scrutiny that's, happening today, especially with, the hospice fraud issue, which I'm sure you're well aware of. Of all of those, which one concerns you the most? Or is there
Yeah.
one that concerns you the most?
Hospice fraud and home health fraud. And Mark, you could probably appreciate this back at Wilshire. This is nothing new, you know, and it's I've seen it my whole career. Starts honestly with the doctors. There are so many doctors out there that want to be part of your organization by being your medical director, and that's how they get paid to refer. And you've got home health care agencies and you've got hospices that have 5, 6, 7 medical directors. And this is where it all starts, and it flows down to administration who are trying to take on patients that aren't eligible for hospice. And when I was president, or excuse me, chair of CASA back in 2010 to 2012. Wow, 14 years ago. Back in LA County, there were over 900 home health care agencies. I wasn't in hospice, so I didn't pay attention. And I used to say to myself, my God, how does 900 home health care agencies survive? Maybe you need a third of those. So that means two-thirds of them are not going to survive legitimately. And many of them are doing the things that you read about today. That really, quite frankly, just disgust me.
Yeah, of course. Of course. Let's switch gears here for a second, Barry. Let's say you're today a young Barry Berger and you're going to start again. You're going to start another home-based care company. What opportunities would excite you the most right now, today, if any?
Well, I would be scared, aware, maybe not scared is the right word, aware of the competition. And like anything else, I would try to figure out what's going to set me apart from my competition. Now, one of the things that I did in my company where we were very hands-on at the end of my career, we had 2,500 people a week working for us. And it was a large organization, something I was very proud of. We also maintained a 4.5-star rating for our home health care agency. We had three divisions. We had our private duty, non-medical home care, which is where I started. We ultimately got into home health. And then, but the biggest revenue producer for my company was I learned about the regional center program back when I first started. And the regional center is an organization, a statewide organization that provides that provides services to developmentally disabled citizens. And I latched on to that program day one when I started because I was familiar with it with this company, Quality Care. And I learned about it, and I learned the politics behind it. When I started my business, the state of California had more money than they knew what to do with it. And the surpluses were incredible of the state. And that population of people were really protected by the Lanterman Act that Senator Lanterman must have had a probably autistic child, whatever. He enacted this legislation, which means these 6 million, probably more, citizens are so protected by this for the services they get. As population grew, as autism became a big thing in the 90s and 2000s, as the state started to have financial problems, the whole respite program for the regional center changed. And they actually tried to get rid of the middleman, like me, and pay the families directly to hire their own caregivers. Well, what I did was went to the regional centers, and there were 21 up and down the state. And I said to them, if you really think that you're going to save money by cutting me out and all my colleagues that are providing, you're crazy. This is going to cost you more money, and the liability that you're going to have, that you're taking on, you're not thinking this. And I said, I got a proposal for you. Pay me 25% more than what you're paying and keep the program the same. In other words, let the families pick their own caregivers. Let them schedule their own caregivers, but let me pay them. Let me take on the liability of workers' comp, malpractice, paying these people directly and making sure that the labor laws are followed, all the things that you would do in traditional home care. It's going to cost you more, but I'm going to guarantee you you're going to save. And they looked at me like, what are you, crazy? And I said, no. And I said, you're going to get sued for workers' comp. People are going to, I go, and there's labor issues. Anyhow, long story short, One of the regional centers must have gotten hit up with some problem. They dusted off my proposal and they said, let's try this. And sure enough, we tried it. They gave me 200 clients to begin with, and everything I told them was going to happen, happened. And they wound up saving money. Well, all these other regional centers couldn't jump on this quick enough. And my margins were very, very small, not traditional home care. Uh, but you took away the scheduling and the recruiting process, and all you became was a payroll service,
Yeah.
you know, and it worked well. And that's what really launched my business was we at the end had over 6,000 consumers that we were billing every month for these services. And then other people, such as the company that I sold to, Aviana, and 24-hour home care, some of the big names, early on saw what I was doing and jumped into this program and became the employer of record. That's what it was called.
So Barry, let's get out the Barry Berger crystal ball. Now we've got artificial intelligence that's starting to make a difference in our, in home-based care. Excuse me, remote monitoring, tons of other emerging technologies. What changes do you think we'll be seeing over the next 10 years? How are all these and are you a fan of things like artificial intelligence, or does it scare you? Because there seems to be, two groups of people. Either you're scared to death, or you welcome it and come on in. Let's go.
Well, as a person that when I bought a Tesla in 2014, I said to the dealer, I said, you're going to have to work with me on this car because I'm very technically challenged. And I said, let me put it in perspective. I said, the biggest technical advancement of my lifetime was the color TV. So when it comes to AI, it's like, seriously, whatever. I don't, I think it's great. I think it's going to solve a lot of problems. I think people are freaked out about the labor market, how it's going to affect it. I'm a glass half full person, hopefully thinking it's going to provide opportunities within the infrastructure of AI to provide jobs that instead of becoming an auto mechanic, you may become an AI programmer or help build the infrastructure, whatever. So I think you're going to see a huge shift in our economy to this.
But in terms,
RadNet,
but in,
RadNet,
but in terms of home-based care, I mean, how do you think it will apply there? Will it make it more efficient, particularly in the compliance areas?
it may, I see again a lot of scheduling. I see some products out there that I'm not really familiar with, but it seems like they're taking scheduling solutions, probably payroll solutions, a lot of the things that we did manually and just automating it where people could get paid quicker, they could get scheduled quicker, there could be more compatibility between clients and caregivers. I'm sure the software companies today are all getting into that model. I think for the licensed uh, staff, the ability to do your progress notes, your nursing notes on the fly, instead of having to come home and work 2 hours on and remember what you did for Mrs. Jones versus Mrs. Smith. I'm sure this is going to be a big, big solution.
Yeah, I talked to a provider the other day, a home health provider, and he was talking about the fact that his nursing staff, their notes are done before they even get to their automobile, leaving the patient's house. At this point, it's really cut down on on time spent. But let me get to something else here. I want to talk about leadership for a minute because I know you have mentored countless leaders throughout your career. What do you think separates great leaders from the average ones?
I think it's the passion. I think it's when I got involved with CASA, I was on the board for 12 years. And, when I first joined the board and I was asked and I was a member at large, um, I sat back and I just listened. But that was for about 10 minutes for my first board meeting. Uh, but I caught the fire. And I think part of the obligation of, if you're in the industry, if you are providing services, whether you're just starting or you're a agency that has had its success, every business has three phases: survival, profit, and growth. And if you're in that profit and growth and or survival, you owe it to yourself to get involved in your trade association. Now, are you going to do it to the extent that I did, where I spent countless hours involved with it? It doesn't have to be there. It could be getting on a committee. It could be dipping your toes in the water and getting involved in advocacy. And you're going to learn so much. And I always used to say, being part of CASA makes you a better provider. To understand what's going on up in Sacramento, to be able to sit down with elected officials, be it in Sacramento or in Washington, D.C., have dinner with them, which we did a lot of, to get to understand the politics of the state and the federal government, is only going to help you run your business and develop your strategy with the knowledge that you're gaining.
Well, I would think just being around other providers too would, allow you to network and find out what other people are doing, down the street or in another city. They might be doing things that you're not that may make you a better provider.
Right. Absolutely. And, it's funny that you mentioned that, Mark, because, my first 5, 7 years of running the business, I could not be in the same room as my competitors. If I went to network
Right.
events, I would see ABC competitor, my blood would boil. And it was just a competitive nature in me, and I'm sure their blood was equally boiling. But as you get more mature, as you get more confidence, as you realize competition is good and networking, you don't have all the answers, exactly what you said. You learn from other providers. And then you become a mentor to other providers to try to help them and encourage them on maybe strategy or maybe try this or that. I knew, somebody was not going to put me out of business at that point in time. And through my involvement with CASA, you just meet a lot of people and you try to help them achieve whatever their goal may be.
I have a couple more questions for you, Barry. What's the biggest lesson you've learned in business?
Number one thing that I learned and that I did, and I go back to relationships. And I'm not talking about relationships with referral sources, talking about the relationships in general. When people ask me what made me successful, and it wasn't me, what made the business successful, it was the relationships. And I'll tell you, it was the relationships, obviously, with the referral sources. It was the relationships with the people you served. But more important, it was the relationships of the people that worked with you, the people behind the offices, the people in the cubes, the field nurses, the caregivers, treating them with respect. I had a philosophy in my business, is when I walked around my office and I took a look at the 130 people that were in the office, I said to myself, these people don't want to be here. They would rather be at the beach. They would rather be home watching TV or whatever, but we all have to pay our bills. So as opposed to you're lucky you've got a job, the philosophy it accredited was we're happy to have you. And when you deal with that type of environment and you set that up, people stay. And the greatest thing that I see is my relationships. And I'm going to take it a little bit further, and I'm going to tell you how this whole thing kind of wound up coming full circle. 4.5 years later, the people that worked with me, and I never used the word for me, they worked with me. And a lot of you know these people that were my senior management team. And I haven't given them a paycheck in 4.5 years, but they're my family. And 4.5 years later, no strings attached. They are very, very close. And to show you how things have worked or not worked out, I'm going to share something with everybody here they may or may not know. My wife of 40 years passed away in December.
Yeah, I'm sorry to
Very
hear that, Barry.
Yeah, very unexpectedly. So, needless to say, it was a really tough period of time for me. I had her on hospice. I became, um, for 41 years, I sat on one side of the desk, and then on the 42nd year, I was on the other side of the desk as a consumer. And thank God, I knew what I was doing. I got a great hospice, and I took care of her final days. I had her funeral, and I figured 50, 60 people would show up. I had 140 people there. About 60% of them were my accredited family, including Casa, including Joe Halfkinshield and Sua Vang, and a bunch of other people from Sacramento who never met Taffy, never met my wife, came down to support me and support her. And when I talk about relationships, this is exactly what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the senior people who were taken care of when I sold my business. I'm talking about caregivers. I'm talking about people that were administrative people that came out to mourn her. In March, 3 months later, I had a heart attack. And the same group of people supported me during my time in the hospital. I have 2 dogs in my home that need to be taken care of. And this group of people came together as my family and told me not to worry. And when I came home from the hospital, I had 24-hour caregivers around the clock through the people that worked for me. I say this because it's reality of what happened to me. And I say it because we discussed a lot about relationships in this episode. And these relationships, if they're done right, will last beyond the life of the agency or of your business. And that's the one thing I treasure. And I strongly believe in CASA. I think as a provider, you owe it to yourself to be a member and to support the industry. When I retired in 2021, I started a charitable foundation that every year I give substantial money to various charities. In fact, on Friday, I'm going to the MS Gala as their guest because that's one of the charities. But I made a 10-year commitment to CASA, $100,000 a year, so it's $1 million that I am contributing to CASA. That's how much I believe in it, that I want this organization, as best as I can help, to continue and to continue to be the voice of the industry here in California.
Well, Barry, we appreciate that. And what a great story. You're such a supporter of home-based care in California, period, and such a great supporter of CASA. And I'll tell you what, my takeaway from this entire conversation and is relationships. That
Yep.
seems to be it was the key to your early success.
Yeah.
So, Barry, this has been an incredible conversation. Thank you. You've provided not only a bit of a history lesson for us, but also, I think, too, a bit of a roadmap for the future. The home-based care industry here in California owes a great deal to pioneers like you. who've helped build the foundation that today's providers stand on. So we're standing on your shoulders, Barry. So thank you for your
Thank you.
leadership, your advocacy, and your continued commitment to helping patients receive care with dignity and compassion and excellence. And thanks to all of you for joining us for another episode of At the Table with CASA. And also want to make sure we thank our sponsor, Access, for supporting conversations that move this industry forward across California. If you enjoyed this conversation with Barry, please subscribe. Please subscribe. Share it with a colleague and visit CASA.org to learn more about how CASA is advancing and protecting care at home throughout California. Barry, thank you so much for joining us today. Until next time, I'm Mark Wilson, and we'll see you again at the table.